It's not difficult to find sources about the Cropsey Maniac. That is, if you're looking for what has overwhelmingly taken the place of the original urban legend. Finding an article that doesn't devolve into a true crime tell-all about Andre Rand, the serial kidnappings, assaults, and murders of disabled children from Staten Island is nearly impossible. In fact, we've even addressed the true crime events here, but only in juxtaposition to the forgotten origins of the Cropsey Maniac urban legend. Welcome to Puzzle Box Horror's first series, where we dive into the creepiest urban legends from around the world. I'm Macabre Mary, and today we'll be discussing the origins of the legendary Cropsey Maniac. If you enjoy this series, please feel free to like, share, subscribe, and leave us some feedback in the comments below. In 1977, the New York Folklore Society published an article that detailed some of the varied accounts of the Cropsey legend. These accounts came from a survey of 11 New York City informants, which Breselman acquired in the fall of 1966. What Breselman found in his survey was that while all of the accounts varied on specific details, a majority of the significant plot events went relatively unchanged. As a time-honored tradition of summer camps in New York and some surrounding regions, children would attend bonfires and hear the story of the Cropsey Maniac. Once a well-respected member of the community, the accidental death of a loved one sparks a homicidal madness within him, and drives him to stalk and kill children who stray off the grounds of the camp. Peter Sherman, a former camper and counselor at Camp Lakota on Maston Lake in Wurtsboro, New York, came forward with a variation of the legend that he heard first.
George Cropsey was a judge. He had a wife and 2 children, all of whom he loved very much. He owned a small summer cottage along the shores of Maston Lake. His wife and children would go there for the summer months, and he would come up to visit with them on the weekends. One night, 2 campers snuck away from the camp's secluded evening activity and went down to the lake to roast some marshmallows. The fire they built went out of control, and there was a big fire on the lake. George Cropsey's family was burnt to death. When Cropsey read the report in the newspaper, it is said he became completely white and disappeared from his home. 2 weeks later, one of the campers from Lakota was found near the lake, chopped to death with an axe. There was talk of closing the camp for the remainder of the summer, but they didn't. The camp owners insisted upon constant supervision of the campers. There were state troopers posted in the area, and each counselor slept with either a knife, an axe, or a rifle. One night at about 3 a.m, one of the counselors was awakened by the screams of one of his campers. He put a flashlight in the direction of the screams and saw his camper bleeding to death, and standing over him, a man with chalk white hair, red bloodshot eyes, and swinging a long, bloody axe. When the maniac saw the light, he ran from the bunk, but the counselor chopped at his leg with the hatchet he was armed with. The man got away, but left a trail of blood into the woods. The state troopers were called and followed the trail into the woods. They called to Cropsey to surrender, but all they heard was crazed laughter. They determined his position, and when he would not give himself up, they built a circle of fire around him. When the fire had subsided, they searched the woods for his remains, but could find nothing. The police closed the file on George Cropsey, assuming him to be dead. It is said that on the evening of the anniversary of the death of Judge Cropsey's family, you can see the shadow of a man limping along the shores of Maston Lake.
Summer camps weren't the only locations where these stories were told. Boy Scout circles, summer jobs, middle schools, high schools, and even universities were hotspots for spooky storytelling. Regardless of where the informant heard the story, their version was always localized to their respective camp or school. Whether George Cropsey was the owner of a hardware store, a member of the city council, a county judge, or a retired businessman, he always seemed to be one of the best-liked men in town. In each story, he has a wife and at least one child who would suffer an accidental death. This tragedy would cause Mrs. Cropsey to die from her grief shortly after her child. In other variations, Cropsey's wife and children would die together in an uncontrolled fire or some other inexplicable accident. George Cropsey would disappear, stew in his madness, and that's when campers would begin to go missing or turn up dead. When the police got involved, they would organize local residents into search parties. These volunteers would comb forests and even drag the nearest lake in an attempt to locate the missing children. The terror continued as more campers and counselors went missing, or camp dorms went up in flames. Cropsey would take his revenge upon the innocent souls he deemed responsible for the misfortune that befell his family. Once authorities realized it was George Cropsey perpetrating all of these heinous acts against the youth, a manhunt would ensue. In many versions, Cropsey is somehow cornered, whether by a fire intentionally set in the forest, bullet holes penetrating the boat he was using to escape, or by chance of him plummeting to his death off of a cliff. It is believed that Cropsey died, although no body was ever recovered. This would lead to the lingering suspicion that he was still out there somewhere, waiting to continue his murderous rampage. Throughout all of the accounts that Breslin acquired, the motif of the death of children as punishment remains the same. The purpose of the legend would illustrate that the average person, who might be trusted in an urban setting, may not be trustworthy in unfamiliar places. It shows the uncertainty of what might lurk in nature and serves as a warning away from the unknown. When The Burning came out in 1981, it wasn't particularly well received, especially in comparison to the other slashers of the time. But it has since become something of a cult classic. Never mind the over-the-top acting, special effects, and stunts that were very period-appropriate, this movie was actually loosely based on the original New York urban legend.
There was a camp not far from here, just across the lake. It was called Camp Blackfoot. No one goes there anymore. Everything burnt down. There's nothing left except the ruins. Now, this camp had a caretaker, a really evil bastard, and his name was Cropsey.
The film follows Cropsey, the abusive, alcoholic caretaker of Camp Blackfoot. The counselors get together and decide that pranking him will be the sweetest revenge for all of the torment he has caused them. When their plan goes more terribly than they could have possibly imagined, it ends with Cropsey engulfed in flames, recovering in the nearest hospital burn unit, and Camp Blackfoot being shut down permanently. The ill-fated prank spurs the beginning of a hunt for revenge years later against the counselors and campers of the local Camp Stonewater. Like other slashers of the time, the killings primarily surround the horniest of teenagers, leaving everyone else as victims of circumstance and convenience. While it's not precisely a blow-for-blow telling of the original urban legend, it ultimately pays homage to it in ways that count. Cultures around the world have always practiced the tradition of oral storytelling. Younger generations would learn important lessons primarily through fables and folklore. This tradition would often relate chilling tales to children about what could happen if they didn't listen to their elders. The community of Staten Island was no different in the mid to late 20th century.
Cropsey, for some reason, became the generic term for a maniac in Boy Scout camps up and down the Hudson River region of New York State. So it would have made perfect sense for a story about a maniac who was hiding out in the woods and who abducted and killed little children to be called Cropsey.
When they told the story of the Cropsey Maniac, it was initially meant to warn them about the hidden dangers of the world. It was also used as a feeble attempt to keep teenagers from misbehaving. After all, Staten Island may have turned into a suburban community, but it was originally established as a dumping ground. And aside from housing local garbage, it was also rumored to be a hotspot for mob body dumps.
It was the least populated, most heavily wooded borough. From what I understand, this is a big dumping ground for mob bodies. Someone needs to be disposed of. It's like, let's bring them to Staten Island.
My search for source material on this legend was originally quite thin. I was only looking for a myth, a legend, a spooky campfire story. My misfortune was that I consistently hit the same wall. All I could find were stories about the real Cropsey, which is what Staten Island locals dubbed Andre Rand, a convicted kidnapper, sexual predator, and suspected serial killer.
Rand had been familiar to police after pleading guilty to sexual misconduct with a 9-year-old girl back in 1969, a crime which he denied.
The origin story of Cropsey is often confused with the real-life tragedy that took place within the Staten Island community that surrounded the Willowbrook State School grounds. It's honestly not that surprising that the story of Cropsey was linked to a devastating series of kidnappings and subsequent killings. After all, there were striking similarities between the spooky story told over summer camp bonfires and the man who later embodied the legend.
Later, as teenagers, we assumed Cropsey was just an urban legend, a cautionary tale used to keep us out of those buildings and to stop us from doing all those things the teenagers like to do. But all that changed the summer little Jennifer disappeared. That was the summer all the kids from Staten Island discovered that their urban legend was real.
Andre Rand became the boogeyman of Staten Island, but he allegedly started out as an employee of Willowbrook State School. Some sources claim that he was an orderly, others that he was a lonely janitor, but according to sources involved in the official case, Rand performed physical therapy for patients of Willowbrook. After his brief 2 years of employment at the Willowbrook State School, Rand didn't leave the area. Instead, he set up his own private shantytown and remained on the grounds of the school.
Andre Rand worked as an orderly at the Willowbrook State School from 1966 to 1968. For years, he lived in numerous makeshift campsites in the woods surrounding Willowbrook.
Rand was allegedly seen with several of the victims before their disappearances, which ultimately pinned him as the prime suspect. One of the female victims was found buried in a shallow grave around 150 yards from where Rand's campsite was located. There was a trial, but the jury was only able to find him guilty of one charge of first-degree kidnapping, sexual abuse, and unlawful imprisonment. This earned him his first 25 years to life sentence. Even though the jury was unable to convict him of the victim's murder, the suspicion of his involvement in the serial killings remains strong to this day. It wasn't until 2004, when Rand was put on trial again, that he was convicted for a second charge and sentenced to another 25 years to life. Andre Rand will be eligible for parole in 2037, and he will be 93 years old.